Let me start with some thank yous. Thank you to our two hosts at ODI and British Council, long-time friends to all of us who've been working on development for, well, some of us for several decades. And thank you both for all the work that you do, and thank you for being with us today. Thank you to this government for the leadership that it's given on development and climate change. Not just on arrival, but before arrival and during arrival. During arrival was important. And after arrival. It's made an enormous difference to the respect with which this country is held worldwide. For example, holding to 0.7% at such difficult fiscal times has gained us enormous respect for all the right reasons, and respect is a fundamental part of any partnership that we are involved with as a nation, and the same applies to the leadership on climate change. But thank you also, Andrew, for what, if I may say so, was a speech not only of leadership but also of inspiration and real power. And it is a very important statement of where development should go, and I trust of where DFID will play its part in that whole story of development. It was a speech of optimism, of action, not just of worry and concern, and that's what's so important. If this turns into a horse race between climate responsibility and growth, climate responsibility will lose. But it is a grave, logical, analytical error to portray it as such a horse race. The two defining challenges of this century are managing climate change and overcoming world poverty. If we fail on one, we fail on the other. If we fail to manage climate change, clearly we create an environment so hostile that development will be reversed, not just halted, reversed, for all the reasons that you described so clearly. But if we try to manage climate change by appearing to or actually putting any obstacle in the way of the improvement of standard of living in the developing world over the next 10 or 20 years, we will not be able to have a world coalition that we need on action on climate change. Neither would we deserve to have it, because we would be making, again, a mistake. So this story of opportunity is fundamental. It's the one that people have to understand. We've made the case on the risks. Every now and again, there are some that we have to remind, rather irritatingly, we have to waste time on that. Well, not waste time, spend time on that. We have to do it. But basically the story now is the story of opportunity, the what to do, the getting on with it, the getting shoulder to the wheel, and that's where we must look. Everywhere you look, there's this integration. If you look at agriculture, no-till agriculture saves water and energy. That's a development story. It makes you more climate resilient. That's an adaptation story, and it reduces carbon emissions. That's a mitigation story. If you look at buildings, it's the same thing. A building which saves energy is a development story. It saves energy. A building that is organized in a way that it is much more green in the sense of having lower emissions, not only because of its reduced energy, that is mitigation. And a building that is more resistant to drought and flood and so on is adaptation. Everywhere you look, it's all bound up together. Now, every now and again you do make the distinction, but we shouldn't labor the distinction. We should just get on with the development story, noting how it's all bound together. And Ethiopia, it seems to me, is an example of just this story of putting together the climate responsibility and the growth, because not only has Ethiopia announced that in 15 years it wants to be carbon neutral or carbon negative, it also wants to be a middle income country in those 15 years, and both are plausible. And the plausibility is increased because they're wound together. So this is fundamental, and it was absolutely the theme all the way through your story, Andrew, and I thought that was very powerful for that reason. What we need then, and let me make very quickly 4 points. We need a new approach to growth and development, which isn't integrative. It's not sort of tearing things up and starting again, but it integrates the kinds of ideas we've just been putting. To put it very crudely, the growth models of the 20th century were, roughly speaking, based on accumulation, more or less fixed coefficients, recognized, definable inputs, not necessarily much substitutability, and no great emphasis on technical progress. I exaggerate only a little bit, but that is the kind of Leontiev-based, Mahalanobis story of growth, the underlying conceptual frameworks which drove a lot of the growth story in the second half of the 20th century. What is the growth model of the future? It is a story of finding new inputs. It's a story of substitutability, replacing things. It's a story of less demand on natural resources. It's a story where ideas and creativity and innovation are huge drivers of the growth process. And it's a story where the environment is not only an input but also an output. Of course the environment is an input. What happens to water? What happens to the local climate fundamentally affects what you can do, the production story. But also they're a fundamental part of the way we live. Any notion of well-being has to involve the environmental story. So it's a story then of a different kind of 21st century growth model. But it's a growth model. And I don't know whether growth is going to go on forever. And as Woody Allen said, eternity is a long time, particularly near the end. But the next 2 or 3 decades, we have to have climate responsible growth. And that is going to be crucial for overcoming poverty. So this different kind of growth story I tried to describe, and which you described also, Andrew, is fundamental to the way we think about development. Secondly, and relatedly, but not the same, is the new industrial revolution. That's about how we get from here to there. And the language of the new industrial revolutions points us to innovation, it points us to creativity, it points us to the driving force of the private sector, because that's the way that industrial revolutions occur. The language allows us to look back at history and see that you do get 2 or 3 decades of creative, innovative growth in that kind of story. If you look back at industrial revolutions since the end of the 18th century. It's a language of competition. It's the language of Schumpeter's creative destruction. And it's the language of some dislocation. And that's what revolutions, that's what happens. You know, whether you're talking about coal mining, which eventually will go away, I hope sooner rather than later. Or you're talking, if you're looking back, about whales and candles when electricity came in. There's dislocation, and that's part of the process. And managing that dislocation is indeed part of the process. So the language of the new industrial revolution, I think, points you not only to the creativity, the private sector, but also to the management of change. And there is a point which we should note, that for developing countries with less baggage to carry in terms of locked-in history, for them that industrial revolution could be a bit easier. And I think some of the developing world, increasingly actually, are recognizing that there are real potential leadership that they can play. And China, for example, will compete like mad on this, and it's exactly the kind of healthy competition that we should welcome and participate in and be a partner in that whole story. Thirdly, there's first the model of growth, then the new industrial revolution, and thirdly, and as you emphasized, Andrew, very strongly, there's a new international economic order here. Who are the big players? The big players are the big economies and the big emitters. The model that we had in 1990 of one superpower, looking back 20 years, was gravely misleading. What we've got now is a very different world, with a very different kind of international politics, with its own challenges, its own competitions, but its immense scope for partnership. And DFID, the British government, British industry, will be a big part of that partnership in the new economic relationships that are emerging. We cannot necessarily look to the United States for leadership on this issue. I don't comment on other issues. But we can't look for them for leadership on this issue. But the story is one of not waiting for that. The story is, as you put it, getting on with it. And there's so much we can do in Europe. There's so much we can do in our partnerships. And we should always remember the United States is not a monolith. There are many parts of it in California and many cities, in New York, and in US history that can come with us and be part of that story. So we have to have a broad view of leadership, a broad view of coalition. Finally, let me say a word or two about the advisory finance, which with Chris Huhn I was a member of and chaired by the Ethiopian and Norwegian Prime Ministers. I do think that this is an area where we can move. You summarised very well, Andrew, and I won't go over again those results. Personally, I think that a price of carbon that we worked off for $20, $25 a tonne in 2020 is far too low. But even with that, we could start to generate the resources that could play a very big part in building the partnership, promoting the new industrial revolution. I hope that we will think of those finances as helping to create the green funds that Andrew referred to. That would be a very good start. You have to start by showing what can be done if you work together, by showing that there is something there for those who want to sabotage agreements, that there's something for them to lose. That's a very important part of the political dynamics of this story. And the Green Fund, I think, established early, particularly an African Green Fund operated in large measure through the African Development Bank with perhaps a third window. You've got the ordinary lending window, you've got the grant windows, and this could be a third window. And you could that way make sure that you're getting, as it were, the combination of public and private, that you've got the combination of adaptation, mitigation, and development by running it, as it were, in a tightly organized way. It would be an example which would show people that we're serious. It'll take us a while to build out these kinds of finances, but it would show that we're serious, and it would show that there's something to lose by being destructive or obstructionist. And that would be very good, I think, for the political dynamics of this story. So thank you again, Andrew. It was a truly inspirational speech. It charts a path which I hope that not only DFID and the UK as a whole will follow and pay attention to, but also many others around the world. Thank you.